Good morning from New York. I'm Sam Cedar in for Chris Hayes. 4 soldiers fighting with the NATO-led alliance in Afghanistan were killed in an overnight attack. Afghan police are suspected to be involved, making it the second insider attack in 2 days. And the State Department has ordered departure of all family members and non-essential U.S. government staff from its embassies in Sudan and Tunisia due to rising security concerns. But right now, my story of the week: how Republicans are using the national crisis of poverty against President Obama. At the Values Voters Summit on Friday, Republican vice presidential candidate Paul Ryan, whose budget was approved by the House with sweeping cuts to aid for the poor, responded to new figures from the Census Bureau this week, showing that 46.2 million Americans were living below the poverty line last year, a rate basically unchanged from the year before, but still a rate not seen in this country for nearly 20 years. Here's what Ryan had to say about Obama's record on poverty.
The Obama economic agenda failed, not because it was stopped, but because it was passed. And here's what we got: prolonged joblessness across the country, 23 million Americans struggling to find work, family income in decline, 15% of Americans living in poverty. Here we are, 4 years of economic stewardship under these self-proclaimed advocates of the poor. And what do they have to show for it? More people in poverty and less upward mobility wherever you look.
It's not the first time this election cycle that we've seen the right raise the specter of the poor. But poverty is raised not to offer prescriptions or remedies, but to be used as a cudgel, as a means of playing on middle-class fears of losing ground by suggesting not so much that they too could become impoverished, but that the threat to their economic stability is the poor themselves who are taking that ground from them. Calling President Obama the food stamp president is not bemoaning the plight of those Americans who, in the wake of a devastating financial crisis, have lost the means to put food on their table for their families, but rather to imply that some other is living large while the rest of us struggle. That said, we do know something about the people Romney relies on and what they believe about poverty. Remember those Romney ads claiming that President Obama was gutting work requirements for welfare eligibility? Putting aside the point that as a policy consideration, work requirements should be loosened for welfare recipients, the claim was simply a lie. But take a look at the source they gave for that claim: the Heritage Foundation from July 12th. As Mother Jones magazine reported the day before Ryan spoke, that July 12th Heritage post was co-authored by a senior research fellow at Heritage named Robert Rector. Now, who is Robert Rector? An opposition research group called the Bridge Project, affiliated with the liberal super PAC American Bridge, dug into Rector's past writings, and it turns out that this false claim that welfare recipients are somehow getting away with living an envious life of leisure was developed by a man who has claimed welfare does not lift people out of poverty, that no one who owns a refrigerator should even be considered poor, and who once told the Washington Post, quote, "Is poverty harmful for childhood? I think not." If you watch the Republican or Democratic conventions this year, you might be forgiven for believing poverty isn't harmful to childhood. For there, we were regaled with stories of parents and grandparents who overcame childhood poverty, lifting themselves out of it with nothing but hard work and dedicated effort. In few instances did these stories even hint that these ancestors had any luck or help from their community that contributed to their success. Nor did we hear how social mobility has diminished in this country since those grandparents supposedly pulled themselves up by their bootstraps. The fact is, it's increasingly harder in the United States to lift yourself and your family from poverty now than it was 50 years ago. And yet, in the midst of a presidential campaign where the economy is ostensibly the central issue of contention, we rarely hear poverty mentioned by either candidate. And according to a new report by Fairness and Accuracy in Reporting, less than 1% of the media's campaign coverage has addressed poverty in virtually any way. That is, at least directly. Consider this. This week's teacher strike in Chicago, more than 25,000 Chicago teachers went on strike over a myriad of issues, not the least of which are the teaching and learning conditions in Chicago schools. The strike exposed the battle lines between the corporate-driven school reform movement and educators fighting against high-stakes testing and advocating for a more contextual approach to measuring school performance. Driving this battle is a desire to improve educational outcomes, which will supposedly improve economic opportunities for low-income kids. Now, to the extent that poverty and joblessness are mentioned in our political discourse, it is always education which is first and often only mentioned as the cure. That prescription sounds intuitive, but what if the premise is wrong? What if Robert Rector is wrong and poverty does in fact harm childhood? A study in 1995 found that the average low-income child enters kindergarten with a listening vocabulary of 17,000 fewer words than that of a child of middle income. She can recognize only 9 letters of the alphabet as compared to the 22 recognized by middle-income children. So if it's possible that the proposition that education fixes poverty is actually backward, and that resolving poverty actually fixes many of our education issues, then we have to consider whether our remedies for both are upside down. We have to consider whether asking teachers to improve achievement in schools is even possible without first addressing the disadvantages poor children face on their very first day of their school careers. And if no amount of privatizing education can fix our poverty problem, we also have to look at the actual impact on poverty that our other policies have. So while the media largely ignore the implications of poverty in stories like the Chicago teachers' strike, our political establishment, meanwhile, has adopted an approach towards dealing with our jobs crisis which is sure not to alleviate poverty, but to create more of it. Austerity plans and the potential of a grand bargain, which may cut Medicare and Social Security, will certainly add to the ranks of the poor. Yet we hear virtually no dissent to these policy proposals from the quarters of our so-called serious thinkers in Washington. How is this possible? How is it that with record numbers of people living in poverty, and with many more people rightfully anxious that they're on the verge of falling into poverty, we as a society are providing no response, not even a rhetorical one? I want to address these issues, especially how they shape the battle over education. So let's bring in Gary Young, a columnist for The Guardian newspaper and The Nation magazine, and author of Who Are We and Should It Matter in the 21st Century? Julie Kavanaugh, a special education teacher in Brooklyn, a member of the teachers group Movement Rank and File Educators, and co-producer of the film The Inconvenient Truth Behind Waiting for Superman. Josh Barro, a columnist for Bloomberg View, and Melissa Botiach, Director of Half in 10 Poverty and Prosperity Program at the Center for American Progress, which aims to cut poverty in half in 10 years. Welcome, all of you, and thank you so much for joining me. So we have this amazing, this strike that's taking place in Chicago and very well may end today. And it really deals with a lot of different issues. The union issues, which of course have been sort of in the headlines for at least since Wisconsin. The political campaign, of course, because of President Obama's relationship to Rahm Emanuel and Penny Pritzker, and his Secretary of Education actually came from Chicago as well. It also involves education reform, and of course, undergirding this, and maybe laying on both the bottom and the top of it, education plays a big part in this. But I want to start with you, Gary. You've been reporting on this. Just give us a sense of how we got here with the Chicago teachers' strike.
Well, Chicago's been a kind of crucible of reform for a couple of decades. So it didn't just start with Rahm Emanuel, Arne Duncan before him, and on before that. And it's really been an attempt to privatize the education system. That would be the easiest way to describe it. So Rahm Emanuel comes in with a reform agenda. Millions are invested in kind of trying to promote charter schools and also to change the strike laws so that you would need 75% of the eligible voters, teachers will need to actually strike. And
in fact, the strike laws were changed a year ago, and it also narrowed what the teachers could actually strike in response to.
Right, so they could only strike about pay and conditions. They couldn't talk about class sizes or whatever, so they would necessarily look self-interested and venal. So Rahm comes in with his reform agenda. He immediately reneges on the previous agreement that the teachers had for a pay increase. Then comes a push for the longer working day, for which he wasn't going to pay teachers very much more. I think 2% more for a 15-20% longer working day. Then there's a change in the strike laws. the teachers have a vote, and they vote 98% to strike. I mean, it's almost North Korean kind of proportion, the kind of volume of teacher dissatisfaction by that point. The city then try and put it into touch. They give it to an arbitrator to say that, you decide where we should go. The arbitrator actually decides to side with the unions. Throughout this time, the overwhelming number of parents in Chicago side with the teachers. Even after the strike begins on Monday, they side with the teachers. So Rahm Emanuel describes this as a strike of choice. About that, he's right. But it wasn't a choice of the unions. It was a choice of Rahm Emanuel. It was set up to work like this. But the teachers' union had been doing a lot of work in communities. A lot of schools had been closed down, which had fired up communities as well as teachers. And a lot of this had happened in the predominantly black and Latino areas, which brings us on to the strike. A massive show of force, cars hooting all around the city pretty much every day, big rallies around the city. Yesterday, a huge rally with teachers coming in from Wisconsin and elsewhere, which brings us to what I think has happened is that the city blinked.
Yes, and we're going to hear today at 3 p.m. we're going to see the teachers' leadership vote, at least, as to whether or not they're going to accept the terms or have a tentative deal. We got to take a break, but what I'd like to do when we come back is to actually bring in a parent, because I think one of the big aspects of this story is the parents' support and this notion that the teachers are striking. They can't necessarily fully articulate, at least officially, what they're striking upon. We're going to take a break. We'll be right back. So we're talking about the teachers' strike, and one of the amazing elements that we were just talking about is that as a parent of a school child, the idea that my child would not have school for 5 days, and the scrambling that would have to take place in my household to deal with that. And still after that, you have 65% of parents supporting the teacher strike is pretty amazing. And part of that, Julie, I think is that while the Illinois Labor Relations Act says that teachers can only strike for compensation reasons, basically for money, there's been a lot of teachers and even some officials of the union who have said, essentially, this is about the conditions. A lot of it has to do with the conditions that we're supposedly teaching in. Tell us what you know about those conditions.
Yeah, I mean, the strike was obviously about working conditions, but working conditions are student learning conditions. So in Chicago and certainly across the country, what we see is huge class sizes. In Chicago, there are class sizes in the 40s, children packed into a room with no air conditioning, the proliferation of charter schools, which is draining money from the public school coffers, school closings, which Gary mentioned, and of course this huge issue of high stakes testing, which isn't just a teacher issue. It's an issue that is very detrimental to students. So the CCU has done a really great job of articulating these issues, and this isn't just a Chicago situation. This is a national and an international problem that we're facing with the privatization of public education, and teachers' unions are in the best position to really advocate against these harmful policies. And we're seeing on the local level in Chicago really a defining moment, and hopefully the beginning, not the ending today at 3 o'clock, the beginning of a real fight to end corporate education reform.
I mean, just to come in on that kind of the Chicago school strike was not just about Chicago. I mean, that's a kind of very important point to reiterate. This conversation is taking place all over America,
right,
and actually pretty much all over the Western world. It's a very similar conversation going on in my home country of Britain, which is a withdrawal of education as a public good, something that is free at the point of service and which is good for the public, and instead the introduction of kind of for-profit privatization and a kind of rote testing, particularly for poor kids. The rich kids get their art, they get their libraries, they get all of that, but for the poor kids, it's drill.
In fact, and Melissa, that's part of what's going on here, is that that's why we say that poverty sort of lies on top of this issue and below it, because the reason we see this redistribution of resources to essentially charter schools and privatized education facilities away from public schools is because the public schools are basically servicing middle income and lower income children, and they have less sort of political power in which to get those resources.
Right, and the whole way the funding formula is set up is that it's tied to property taxes. And so you have these built-in inequalities that we need to tackle through reforming some of the federal funding streams as well. So you're seeing these kids already coming in at a disadvantage because in 0 to 5, that's a critical time for a child's brain development. Their brains are like sponges during this time. And you see kids entering in the school system already at a disadvantage. As a country, not only have we not invested enough in education K through 12, we haven't made significant investments or significant enough investments in early childhood education to get kids ready to enter school on par with their middle and higher income peers.
Yeah, this is a blog post by a teacher who's on strike named Shion Barrett. And he explains here why he went on strike. And he wrote, "When you make me cram 30 to 50 kids in my classroom with no air conditioning so the temperatures hit 96 degrees, that hurts our kids. When you lock down our schools with metal detectors and arrest brothers for play fighting in the halls, that hurts our kids. When you take 18 to 25 days out of the school year for high-stakes testing that is not even scientifically applicable to many of our students, that hurts our kids. When you spend millions on your pet programs, but there's no money for school-level repairs so that the roof leaks on my students at their desk when it rains, that hurts our kids." Yep. And here is a parent from Chicago making the case that this money is being redistributed essentially away from the public schools into one of these pet projects, and he speaks about how unfair it is. His name is Matt Farmer, and he was delivering this speech at a CTU rally back in May 30th.
Your kids attended the University of Chicago Laboratory Schools, correct? Yes. Same school Mayor Rahm Emanuel has chosen to send his kids to, correct? The University of Chicago Laboratory School has 7, count them, 7 art teachers on its faculty. Isn't that right, Mrs. Pritzker? Yes. But you're aware, Mrs. Pritzker, that Dyett High School, a school you just voted to close a few months ago, had 0 art teachers on its faculty in 2011. Isn't that right? Yes. Your students also receive music education from day one at the lab school. Isn't that true? Yes. Your students had physical education classes every day at the lab school. Isn't that right? Yes. Your students had libraries, beautiful libraries in which to study, research, and write. Isn't that true? Yes. You're aware, ma'am, that as we sit here today, 160 CPS schools do not have libraries. Isn't that right?
That was Matt Farmer, and he was he's a parent from Chicago Public Schools, and we're going to have Matt Farmer in from Chicago, one of those parents who has been supportive of the teacher strike, right after this. We'll be right back. I want to bring in Matt Farmer. He's a Chicago public school parent and lawyer, also a member of the local school council at Philip Rogers Elementary School. Welcome, Matt. Thanks for joining us.
Good morning. Thanks for having me.
So, Matt, you were making a case to Penny Pritzker, a member of the Chicago Public School Board, that essentially your kids and the kids in Chicago Public Schools deserve the same opportunities to express their creativity, to be, in some ways, I don't know, coddled is the right word, but to be allowed to sort of think and learn in a more creative space. Tell me what's behind that. I mean, how much you feel that your child is losing out by not having these opportunities?
Well, let's be clear. I raised the names of Rahm Emanuel and Penny Pritzker in my May 23rd talk to teachers, not because they're very wealthy people who send their kids to private schools. They are, and they have the right to do that. But both of them at this point are public officials making education policy for all our public school kids. And it's in that capacity that I asked the rhetorical questions I did of Ms. Pritzker and the mayor. because they know and they advocate for things for their own kids, which they are not quick to provide to our kids, 85% of whom are black and brown in the Chicago public school system, 87% of whom are low-income kids. Let me give you an example. I talked about the lack of libraries in our schools. 160 CPS schools do not have libraries. Meanwhile, Ms. Pritzker, who has great ties to the University of Chicago Lab School, is spearheading a fundraising drive to raise money for newer, better libraries for the lab school, because as the lab school and its parents know, those are important things for a child's education. 2 years ago, almost to the day, a group of Mexican-American mothers in Chicago's Pilsen neighborhood began a sit-in that lasted, I believe, 47 days at the first stretch, because they were trying to get a library for their kids' grade school. They were threatened with arrest. During the sit-in, the head of Chicago Public Schools threatened to turn, or in fact did turn the heat off in the building they occupied as temperatures got cold in October. There's still no library at that school. I spent a lot of time with those moms and during that sit-in. And one of the things we heard from Chicago Public School spokesperson was essentially this talking point. Why do you think you're special? We've got 160 schools that don't have libraries. When you're on a sit-in, you've got nothing but time on your hands. So this enterprising group of moms and students and community activists served up a Freedom of Information Act request on Chicago Public Schools. What we learned was, yes, there are 160 schools without libraries, but we requested the data. Where are those schools? We plotted them on a map, and only 18 of them were north of North Avenue in the city of Chicago. And what that means to your national viewers, that the other 142 schools were concentrated in the south and west sides of Chicago, where we have the most concentrated poverty and segregation. So there is a profound difference in the types of resources that kids in different parts of town receive. That's a big problem. So when Sean Barrett talks about the lack of air conditioning, the lack of resources, his kids talk about the lack of textbooks, this is very real.
And so, Melissa, this is not uncommon, right? I mean, we're looking at people who have no political constituency or no political power, so their needs for their children are simply not addressed.
Right. I mean, you have something like 70% of low-income schools that are in need of some kind of modernization or repairs. And when you're in a learning environment where the roof is leaking, where there's not a library or enough books, it becomes harder to level the playing field so that low-income children have the same shot at the American dream as their peers in higher income groups.
And Julie, what about this notion that and I've noticed this in terms of even in charters in this city, and I'm not, obviously we can't make a blanket statement about charters, but the charters are much more rigid. They don't allow for the sort of the creativity that you might see at like one of these these experimental schools. What of that notion that creativity and sort of lateral thinking is something for wealthier kids, and but lower income kids, they just need to learn how to sort of survive in the business world?
Right. I mean, it's inherently racist. It's certainly part of the larger class war in this country, and the very people who are creating these policies choose the exact opposite for their own children. And instead of investing hundreds of million dollars, and the state of New York alone raised to the top was $700 million, and pretty much all of that money is being used for high-stakes testing. We could be using that money to provide art teachers, provide music teachers, not just air conditioning. That's, we're talking about the narrowing of curriculum and the lack of experiences that would really bridge that achievement gap or that poverty gap. But unfortunately, our policymakers are taking this in a completely different direction. We need early childhood intervention. We need to level the playing field so that when our children enter fifth grade, kindergarten, when they're 5 years old, you don't have kids in a class who are reading on a second grade level and kids in a class who don't recognize their name. That's not a teacher problem. That's not a union problem. That's society's problem. And we need to invest in real reforms that will address these issues.
The funny thing, though, is, we haven't gotten to what, as I understand understand it, are the two key sticking points that have brought this into the strike and that are looks like are finally being resolved, which are not these conditions issues and are not compensation issues. It's the way teachers are going to be evaluated in the city of Chicago and the extent to which testing of students is going to flow through to actual evaluations of the staff, and then how teachers will be recalled or rehired.
We'll get to that when we come back. We'll talk about how we evaluate teachers and those issues, and if they really are the prominent issues in this strike. Mm-hmm. When we left, Josh, you were raising the issue of this strike was, in your opinion anyways, a function of the issues of teacher evaluations and the idea of how teachers are laid off.
Right. Basically, the two, what I understand to be the two most, the biggest points of contention that they've had the most difficulty agreeing on are how teachers will be evaluated and what role testing will play in that. And then when teachers are laid off, how rehires will be done, because the district is expecting to close a large number of schools, and the union basically wants to say, well, when you hire new teachers, you have to start rehiring the teachers who were laid off. The public schools position is that the principal should be able to decide who they want to hire without regard to some sort of rehire tree. And so I think
we should make it clear on the layoffs. That's when they decide to close a school. So it's not based upon the evaluation of the specific teachers there.
Right.
It's an evaluation of the school, and so they essentially get rid of all the teachers.
Right.
And the union's saying we want those teachers who have really not been evaluated as individuals to be first in line when you consider rehiring.
Right. Exactly. And as I understand it, I know it's been fluid, but that they're talking about something where they'll class them into like a high performer and low performer, and have that right only for those who had the relatively high evaluations. But with regard to these, issues of conditions, that as far as I can tell, they've come to terms on that. They've agreed to rehire about 500 teachers in non-core subjects in order to be able to offer more things like physical education and art in more of these schools. But the real point of contention is to what extent teachers should be held accountable for the performance of their students, and in what way that accountability is done, and then how much flexibility principals should be given in staffing their schools versus trying to give enhanced job security to teachers in the Chicago public schools. So I think this is the key question, is how you balance these working condition issues for teachers with the ability of the public school system to be able to evaluate teachers and hold them accountable, and to staff itself as it so chooses.
Now, okay, go ahead.
To some extent, because you're absolutely right there, Josh, but to some extent, when the CPS has gone for teachers, they've really been knocking over straw men again and again, because I haven't met a single teacher who doesn't believe that there should be some kind of evaluation. It's the nature of the evaluation.
Right, and I think, to be fair, Josh mentioned that, and my understanding is that the value added, which is a measure of where you evaluate a teacher based upon what the students do, as opposed to what the teacher is doing. To the extent that the union has a problem with that use of evaluation, they're only arguing about to what degree it should go into their evaluation, as opposed to 40% versus 25%.
But specifically tests. It's specifically tests. I mean, there are peer evaluations. There are a range of ways in which teachers can be evaluated. But when tests are, and this is the kind of principal spearhead of this school reform movement, when tests are at the forefront, then teachers teach to tests. They don't teach children, they teach tests.
And that's fine, but the problem is you have a situation now where north of 99% of teachers are rated satisfactory or better. And so I'd be happy to see an evaluation system that involves more subjective criteria and more peer evaluations, so long as it's a system that actually holds teachers accountable for performance and doesn't amount to a rubber
Julie,
stamp.
those tests exist, right?
Right. I think the problem is it would be nicer to have a more well-rounded evaluation system, but that's not the policy that's on the table. The policy that's on the table that has come through Race to the Top is a huge percentage of these evaluations based on test scores. And what we know about test scores is what they really are a measure of is socioeconomic status. So when we're talking about children in areas of high poverty, and we're talking about using tests to rate and judge and hire and fire their teachers, we're talking about something that's very dangerous. When you look at the NAEPS, the National Standardized Tests that are used in the United States and around the world to sort of rank countries in terms of educational outcomes. If you account for poverty, the United States is actually at the top. When you factor in the students who live in poverty, we fall down to the bottom. Poverty matters, and I think the union has drawn a line in the sand on this evaluation issue, not because it's a working condition issue solely for the teacher. Working conditions are learning conditions. They're standing up for this because this is a detrimental policy to children, not because it's a detrimental policy for teachers.
But the point of the value-add methodology...
Hold on, let's let Matt get in here for 1 second. Matt, do you want to...
Sure. Let me give you just a couple of real-world examples here in Chicago, so your viewers understand how this standardized test evaluation mechanism would work in the real world here in probably the most segregated school system in the country. Let's take Harper High School in Chicago's Englewood neighborhood. In 2011-2012, 27 former and current Harper High School students were shot. 8 of them were killed. The school is 96% low-income students, 98% African American, has a 73% attendance rate and a 31% mobility rate. What that means is that 31% of the kids who start in a Harper classroom at the beginning of the year don't end up there. Now let's compare that to the school my youngest child attends. We've got 6.5% low-income kids. We've got 5% African-American kids, 97% attendance rate, 2.1% mobility rate. When kids at my daughter's school need help with standardized test prep, the parents can break out a checkbook oftentimes, get the kids the preparation they need. So the fact that the kids at my daughter's school know how to take tests is more a function of their background, where they came from. They're not worried about their classmate having been shot the previous week. They're not among the 15,500 homeless kids in the Chicago public school system, for whom there are currently 370 social workers in 684 schools. You want to know how the kids do on standardized tests? Look at their zip codes. Look at what their parents do for a living.
All right, well, we're going to take a break, and Josh, you can come back and respond to that. But, I mean, we're setting up this notion that that poverty will implicate even the evaluations of teachers because we're evaluating teachers based upon how the students are doing, and poverty is implicating how those students do in the classroom. We'll be right back. So we've been talking about how one of the problems in measuring the ability and the quality of teachers is a function of the social context in which students enter into the schools, and that's going to affect how they perform. And it's, in many respects, not telling us anything to judge their performance as a result of how teachers are teaching.
Well, if what we're coming up with here is that it's unreasonable to expect teachers who do their jobs well to show up as increased student performance, that says something extremely depressing about our ability to improve social outcomes through public education. If you know I think that may be the case. I think it's a little strange to address this as an either-or question. Like, do we need to improve educational standards and improve the performance of schools, or do we need to address childhood poverty and crime and other issues so that children are in a better position to learn? It seems clear to me that the answer is that we need to do both of those things. But I think it's quite dangerous to basically say, well, because the situation is so dire socially in these urban areas and these poor areas, that we shouldn't even expect to be able to measure educational performance.
Well, that's true, but there's a limit to how much you can expect of one without the other. There's a limit to how much educational excellence you can get when kids are getting shot and they're not eating breakfast, and everything that they're doing outside of the classroom is so is so dysfunctional.
This is a chicken and egg type of question. I mean, because on one hand we expect education to solve poverty. On the other hand, it is poverty which in some way inhibits the ability for a lot of our kids to be educated.
And I would ask the question, is part of this intentional? The national conversation, specifically the corporate ed reform conversation, the deformer conversation, is poverty doesn't matter, and a good teacher in front of every kid is what matters. And I say this is a convenient way of doing nothing at all when it comes to poverty. You're right, we have to do both, but we're not doing both. And why isn't the conversation about doing both, and why aren't the policies and the reforms targeted at doing both? And this is why the Chicago teachers have stood up, and I thank them for doing it.
I don't think it's the intention to distract that. I don't think that's like what Bill and Melinda Gates are up to. I'm sure that that there are people who would certainly prefer not to spend government money on anti-poverty programs, but I don't think that's by and large the agenda of even the Center for American Progress, which is a major promoter of these sorts of education reforms. But I think I think it's telling that the reason in Chicago that you're going to have all these school closures is the expansion of these charter schools. But the reason nobody forces a public school parent to send their kid to a charter school.
Well, actually, they do. If the school in the neighborhood is closed, then actually the more charter schools there are and the less public schools there are, the less choice you actually have.
Matt Farmer, you want to add something here?
Sure. One of the big concerns teachers and parents have with respect to standardized testing is this. The mayor campaigned on getting a longer day for school children. He took forever to unroll the plans as to how that was going to be funded, what it was going to look like. But the talking points included, adding art, adding music, adding PE, etc. But the choice as to how to do that was going to be left up to the schools. Not a lot of talk about how to fund any of that. Here's the rub, though. These principals, particularly in the south and west side of Chicago, have a sword of Damocles hanging over their head. And that is, if they don't get their test scores up, the schools are going to be closed, the teachers are going to be fired. So if you're a principal and you're suddenly told you've got an extra 45 minutes or an hour a day and here's a small pot of money to do something with it, are you going to start teaching kids how to work a pottery wheel, or are you going to do more kill and drill testing? And on the south and west sides of Chicago, I'm not highly confident that it's going to mean a lot of additional art and music.
Right. Go ahead, Melissa.
As I say, I think Josh has made an important point, though, that we can't let poverty become an excuse that low-income children can't succeed and that education interventions can't make a difference.
Right.
I think it's absolutely both and not either or.
Well, I think the central question is, one, do we need to address poverty to get those educational outcomes? I mean, I don't think anybody's using that as an excuse. Nobody wants to leave our kids uneducated. The question is it efficient to not address poverty first and attempt to educate kids who enter into kindergarten with 17,000 listening vocabulary, 17 less.
Right. I agree that poverty is obviously a very big factor. But if we can invest in early childhood education, if we can make sure that kids are coming to school fed or that they're getting school breakfast and school lunch, if we can make sure that there are community programs and, yes, arts programs to help address some of the trauma of violent neighborhoods and things like that, I don't see a reason why that can't happen on the same track and simultaneously to also pursuing educational reforms that lift up achievement.
Right. Matt Farmer, Chicago Public School parent, thanks for being here. Julie Kavanaugh, New York City school teacher, thanks for joining us. What exactly does it mean to be poor? Well, coming up next, we'll talk about it. We've been talking about poverty in relation to education, but for the bigger picture, listen to how politicians in this country used to talk about poverty.
The hopes of the Republic cannot forever tolerate either undeserved poverty or self-serving wealth.
Many Americans live on the outskirts of hope, some because of their poverty and some because of their color, and all too many because of both. Our task is to help replace their despair with opportunity. And this administration today, here and now, declares unconditional war on poverty in America.
This type of talk doesn't happen anymore, at least not from politicians. Poverty isn't even part of the national consciousness anymore. It's more of an abstraction and not part of the whole. And we want to talk about why that is. So joining me now, we have Tanya Wells, founder of Lives Behind the Numbers, a blog which tracks poverty in the United States. Stephen Pimperi, the author of A People's History of Poverty in America, an associate professor at Columbia University School of Social Work. And Steve Gates, Program Director for the nonprofit group Chicago Youth Advocate Programs, and John Reel, Assistant to the Director for Senior Services America, Inc., a Maryland nonprofit providing assistance to seniors. Tanya, I want to start with you. I was a guest on this program, I guess it was about a month ago, a couple of weeks ago, and you came on and you talked about your experience, particularly, I guess, in the wake of the Great Recession. Just tell us a little bit about what the past couple of years have been like for you and your family.
The past couple of years have been really rough. Since the recession, we had to find ways of maintaining our lives. And one of the things we decided to do was go back to school. Both of us are in school right now. We do have 2 children. And with our school money and assistance through SNAP program, we get our food and we manage to live.
And you went from middle income, upper middle income, essentially. Both you and your husband lost your jobs.
Correct.
And give me a sense of just, now I know you decided at that point to sort of, you had a bit of a dilemma, didn't you, in terms of going back to school? Just explain that for me.
We sure did. Of course, you have to kind of consider, well, if you go back to school, where are you going to get the money to pay for your bills? Where are you going to get the money to pay for your apartment? Where are you going to move that you can afford to do this off of your school loans, your Pell Grant? And how are you going to do it? We actually decided that he would go to school first until he established himself. He did rather well in school. And then at that point, I was still working part-time and kind of maintaining the family that way. Unfortunately, the part-time work wasn't enough. We were still having trouble providing food on the table of my family. So we decided to actually apply for assistance for the first time in our lives. And that was a very devastating moment in our family. It was heartbreaking to me that I had to go in there and actually apply for services. But I knew it was something that needed to be done for my children. I knew it was something that needed to be done for my family. And I did what I needed to do.
Right. And, I want to talk more about sort of the differences of experiences and how it's different to sort of drop from, I guess, middle income into that lower income level. I know, John, you had, I guess, a similar experience in some respects, and we will talk about that when we return. We've got to take a quick break, and we will get back to this conversation.